everyone, and welcome to Pack 75.
Welcome to Pack 75.
Hi, and welcome to Pack 75.
I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Arts and Humanities here at Manchester Metropolitan University. And it gives me great pleasure to open the Pack 75 Viewing the Past and Looking to the Future celebrations to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the 5th Pan-African Congress held here in Manchester in 1945. Our online programme enables us to connect with audiences around the world, and I am delighted to announce that one of our keynote speakers, Kwame Anthony Appiah, will broadcast his speech live from his home in Princeton, USA. We are proud to be working in association with all three Greater Manchester universities and other institutions, including See My World, Contact Theatre, National Black Arts Alliance, Manchester Centre for Public History and Heritage, and the Ahmed Iqbal Ullah Race Centre. Most importantly, we are pleased that this event has had the full involvement of students from across Manchester's universities, participating in interviews, running a Sunday programme, and being important collaborators in the Pack 75 celebrations. It is particularly special that we are hosting this event in Black History Month with the involvement of our students. They have engaged with passion and enthusiasm and will take the learning from these events to future generations. So, thank you for listening, stay safe, and I hope you enjoy the programme of events that we've curated for you. Thank you, and bye for now.
I'd like to say to viewers, you're going to have a really interesting time watching this. We know it's a very different period than what we had originally planned, but we're really looking forward to what will be an amazing online festival of events.
Hello everybody, and welcome to day 3 of the 75th anniversary of the Pan-African Congress celebrations that are being broadcast virtually from MMU. Now today, I'm really happy to introduce you to the next event, which will be an exclusive interview between the acclaimed historian and filmmaker, David Olusoga, and MSA BLM's group, which will include Quadri, who will be having a discussion with him directly after this. Before we start the discussion, can I just go through a bit of housekeeping? This is an open space where we encourage questions, which we ask you to do in a respectful manner. Hate speech will not be tolerated. Also, please be aware that the webinar and the Q&A session is going to be recorded. We will be uploading it to our YouTube channel as soon as is possible, for where it will be you'll be able to view it over the period of the festival. If you would like to post any questions, please use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. These will be filtered to Quadri, and will be sent on to David to respond to. Obviously, we cannot answer all questions, but we will do our best to do so. Also, there will be a further presentation after this, which the BLM MSA team will be involved in doing. So I'll keep that to them to talk about later on. So at this point, I'd say do sit down and do enjoy the conversation. Over to you, Quadri.
Thank you very much for that, Ola. So again, hello everyone, and welcome to our In Conversation series. It gives me tremendous pleasure to facilitate a conversation with the legend himself, David Olusoga, as part of the Pan-African Congress's 75th anniversary celebrations. Now, David and I will be having a conversation over the next half an hour or so, and then I'll be asking him some questions from the audience. So everyone, please start sending your questions in via the chat function. But first, let's remember why David is revered by not just me, but many other people. So David Olusoga is a British-born historian, broadcaster, and filmmaker. Born in Lagos, Nigeria, David studied history and journalism and has won awards as both a presenter and a documentary maker. The self-proclaimed Geordie Nigerian has done more than any other historian of this generation to build public recognition for the ethnic minority cultures in Britain today, but in particular for their past heritage and their contribution to the life of the nation, as well as the sufferings all too often covered over. So David, welcome to the chat. How are you?
Thank you very much. Nice to be here in vision as well as sound.
Lovely, lovely. I guess we should kind of just get started. There's a lot of an interesting dialogue I kind of want to have with you today. First and foremost, let's start with everything that's happened over the last few months in regards to the murder of George Floyd, the subsequent uprisings we've witnessed around the world, and in the UK quite significantly with the removal of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. How have you been coping?
Well, I've been trying to debate how optimistic to be. I think it's important to think about how we felt in 2019 and 2018 during Black History Month in both of those years, because of course, in both cases, particularly 2018, Black History Month arrived at the height of the Windrush scandal, and most people were furious. We were witnessing a scandal that should never have happened, an insult to the Black community, and an event that it's quite obviously we can see from Wendy Williams' Lessons Learned review that happened in part because this history wasn't known, because people in the Home Office didn't really understand the history of the British Empire, didn't understand the history of post-war migration. So this is a very different feeling to be arriving in Black History Month in 2020 with everything that's happened. And what I keep trying to do is trying to work out, engage, and do thought experiments to work out how optimistic or pessimistic I should be. I mean, the question that people ask is this a moment or a movement? And one of those thought experiments is to imagine what you would have thought was possible in terms of race diversity, our capacity to discuss these issues back in January 2020, what you imagine corporations, institutions, societies, governments might have been able to say and do, and initiatives that they might have been willing to launch in 2020 by putting yourself back to January. And I think if you do that, you realize we are in a place we didn't expect to be. We're in a place that is changed far beyond what was predicted or predictable. And I think that does give us room for some optimism. And I'm not used to sort of being in the optimistic space. My main interests are slavery, colonial genocide, the development of the 19th century slums, and the First World War. I'm not normally pushed to the front when they want someone to be optimistic. So I'm unused to being in this position. But I think it would be disingenuous not to take a moment in Black History Month to sit back and marvel at what's been achieved and how it's come about and the momentum that's been created. And I think that that old cliche that to keep a boulder rolling is easier than getting it moving in the first place. We have momentum on these issues. The velocity of movement is up to us now.
Yeah. I'm going to touch up on what you just said quickly. You said it's not just a moment, but rather a movement. And I think that kind of resonates with with the way a lot of Black people or people from a lot of ethnic minorities are really feeling right now, because normally we see these situations as in, you see the problem politically, but then it really starts to hone in and you really feel it personally, especially in the last 6 months. So a lot of people are trying to do these self-care routines and literally just trying to take care of themselves throughout this whole situation. So again, to pose maybe a slightly different question, can you talk us through how you felt as a person of color and the ways in which you're doing self-care in this difficult time?
Well, in some ways, I find this time easier than previous times, because I think the thing that's truly damaging, that is the factor that in part explains the statistics for mental health in the Black British community, is having your daily lived experience dismissed and denied and disavowed. And that form of gaslighting, that form of being told that what you experience is a delusion, I think that is fundamental to the damage that is done through living in a racialized society. And I think the lessening of that in 2020 I found liberating. And I felt less need to feel, normally in Black History Month, what I find myself saying usually when I can give talks and I'm face to face and it's like normal human contact, the other thing we need self-care for, is I found myself saying to people, you have to look after yourself. This is difficult. These conversations are painful. These experiences are painful. Bashing your head against the wall of racism is painful. And that's all true, and that hasn't gone away. But I'm personally finding it easier because I think there's less capacity. There's more people willing to not do that, to tell Black people that what they live and breathe, what is before their eyes, what is in their life, what is in their life experiences, is a delusion. And that's what's truly damaging. The exception is, in some ways, the thing that got us here is that I don't think anybody who is fully human and who watched or tried to watch, in my case, the video of the murder of George Floyd cannot be affected by that. And in some ways, I kind of think we need to bottle that feeling. I think we need to put ourselves back to that moment at the end of May when those images confronted us, and to remember that feeling of shock and disgust, a physical feeling, a feeling in the stomach as well as in the mind, that emotional feeling of disgust, and try to sort of bottle that. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to George Floyd, but that was the catalytic moment. The fact that millions of people, Black and white, could see for some reason in that moment and could feel something in that moment. I think we need to not let go of those emotions, because we've got to fight this fight with intellectual tools and rhetorical tools. But I think we also need to remember that the fuel is emotions. I mean, we're emotional creatures. I think that's where we need to think about self-care, because I haven't made it through the 8 minutes 50 something seconds, and I know most people I know haven't, because it's too painful.
Yeah, definitely. Personally, I haven't made it through that video as well, and I think for a very, very long while to go, or going forward, I'm probably not going to be able to make it through that video. I think also
we've seen enough. We've seen enough, and it's been the catalyst for change. It would be an act of self-harm to willingly confront that when we don't need to.
Exactly, because at the same time you see yourself within George Floyd, and it's like it resonates too much.
But something amazing happened as well, is that white people could see themselves. White people, I was talking to an African American lady this week whose parents were civil rights campaigners, and what strikes them as people who marched in London, and I think you can see this from the film and the photographs of the civil rights movement in America in the 60s, but also in the Black movements in Britain in the 1980s. Think about the march after the New Cross fire. Look at those photographs, and what you see is Black people marching for Black racial equality with a handful of white people. Then look at the marches of 2020. That's everybody. Something happened that enabled a level of understanding and empathy and a willingness to be serious about race this year that I don't think we understand or can explain yet.
True, very true. I think that kind of ties over to my next question then. It's kind of a perfect segue. What inspires you to speak out about racial injustice, and how do you remain so composed, when often placed in a very challenging position whereby you have to discuss issues around race almost all the time?
Well, I mean, I say no to lots of things. I mean, there's lots of scenarios and debates that people would like me to take part in. And I don't believe they exist in good faith. There's lots of people I won't debate because there's no point in debating, because they don't want to debate facts. They want to engage in a culture war, a pre-packaged culture war scenario. And I say no to, I'm always being accused of sort of someone who wants publicity. I don't want publicity. I've been a television producer and I was perfectly happy being a television producer. I became a presenter because it gave me more power as a producer. But the main reason I say that I'm not somebody who seeks publicity is I say no to 90% of things I'm asked to do, because they are culture war traps. They're attempts to use race to divide people and to use the intersection of race and class to divide people. So I say no to lots of stuff, which stops me getting angry. But the other thing is I'm very, very aware that there is a simple, obvious, manifest other trap, which is that race, as it was developed and devised and constructed, created the stereotypes that we still live with. And one of those most powerful stereotypes is of Black people being angry, especially Black men, but also Black women as well. But there's a specific trope, the gender trope for both. And I think people who don't want to listen to what I've got to say would love it if I delivered it with anger. It would be great. It would absolutely fall into that stereotype, and it would be an excuse to not listen. I mean, I think in general, people don't listen when people are shouting, when people are angry. And I think one of the tricks that people pay £30,000 a year for private educations learn is that sort of that calm delivery. I mean, one of the kind of great weaknesses of this country, if somebody is polite and articulate and can marshal a large vocabulary, no matter what they're saying, whether it's rubbish or whether it's appalling, we tend to listen to them. That's what people pay money for, to send their children, the 7% who go to private schools. So to be aware of that and to fall into those traps knowingly, I think would just be strategically not a wise thing to do. So strategically, I have to remain very calm.
Thank you for that. And I feel like it's the same with the majority of Black people in general. There are already these innate or like these stereotypes that have already been brandished on us that we feel like we have to toe a line between, oh, you know, if we go this side, you're perceived as the angry Black man or angry Black woman, and whether it's in an educational setting or professional setting or just a societal setting in general. I feel like it's something that we will have to navigate.
And it's the intersection of the power of that stereotype when combined with the racial gaslighting, the telling you that your lived experiences are a delusion. And then if any frustration you show at that process of stripping you of your identity and your lived reality, any reaction to that is in any way angry or frustrated means you're trapped in another trap. It's like being caught in crossfire. So you're told that you're deluded and that you're crazy and that the things that you can see in front of you don't really exist. And if you get frustrated by that, then they've caught you in another trap. You're an angry Black person. You're not reasonable. You're not rational. You are emotional. You are all the things the stereotypes and the racism built in the 18th and 19th century said you were.
Exactly.
I mean, this stuff's clever. It's sophisticated. Yeah. I think one of my kind of concerns about Black history is we don't talk enough about race. We don't talk about much about the formation of race, how sophisticated it is. I have friends who study apartheid, and what they will all tell you is that when you study the series of laws that built the apartheid state, is you end up just, you know, in some ways not having admiration for it, but having a respect for how clever it is. It's deeply sophisticated. The racism that was developed by the slave owners and then repurposed by the imperialists and given legitimacy by pseudoscience, it's really sophisticated, and it creates these no-win situations. Your lived experience, you're told, is not real, and if you show frustration about it, then you just prove another stereotype and they win in another way.
You're leading me on to these perfect segues because the next one I have for you is, you know, the series Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners that you did. It tells fascinating stories about and often painful stories of the Middle Passage and the lives of enslaved people. So what advice do you have for young scholars, you know, young historians, young Black people in general, who are often finding themselves having to witness instances of racial injustice, who are consuming sometimes very challenging stories about the subjugation of Black people, both historically and in present day?
I think we need to be tough, and I think we also, and you know, this, when I say this, it offends some people, so I'll give it that warning. I think we need to reject this idea that studying the way slavery and empire impacted upon Black people is to see Black people as victims. Because I think to think that talking about slavery and to think that the enslaved are victims and saw themselves as victims, and that is the only narrative that you can understand slavery from, I think is historically illiterate. There were wars in Africa, dozens of wars, in which African societies and African leaders fought against the slave traders. There were defenses built by villages, by cities, against the slave traders. Olusoga Equiano, in his narrative, The Great Abolitionist, one of the most successful books of the 18th century, he describes the defenses his village in Nigeria had built against the slave trade. The reason that there are 40 slave forts, or the ruins of 40 slave forts along the coast of Africa, is because the slave traders were frightened of being attacked by local African kingdoms as well as other slave trading nations. And they were frightened of uprisings in those slave forts, and they were right to be frightened. The reason why the slave ship was a heavy, you know, a high security prison with an armed deck with guns pointing inwards, not outwards, is because we think 1 in 10 slave expeditions had some degree of uprising, and some of them were successful. The Amistad the Clare, the Creole, 18th century slave ships in which 19th century, in which there was uprisings and successful ones. And then there's 40 rebellions in the British Caribbean, there's 250 in North America. These are not people who see themselves as victims. These are people who are fighting. These are people who are resisting in small ways and big ways. And I think there's a terrible danger, and this comes because this history has been delivered to us through this abolitionist narrative in which slave freedom was given to people. I mean, think about the ultimate image of abolition, the prone kneeling African, am I not a man and a brother? Not the African with a torch in his hand burning the plantations, not the image of the African that the slave owners lived in constant fear of. So I think we need to challenge this idea that to talk about enslavement is to confront ancestors who are victims. I think that's not to know life on the plantations or in the slave ships well enough.
Yeah. Now, you and I, we both share Nigerian heritage,
I can tell I had my name pronounced correctly twice. For the first time, a few times in a row. I'll have to eke that out over the coming weeks because it's the last time.
Never gonna mispronounce that name at all. So for me, like, that Nigerian history is one that it's very complex. It's incredibly complex, but also very inspirational. Now, especially when we think about Pan-Africanism and the ways in which it galvanized a new Black imaginary, and we saw a united Black and African liberation seem like a possibility. I would like to ask, what does Pan-Africanism mean to you today, and what lessons can we learn from its history?
Well, Pan-Africanism is something that I've read about more than I've studied, and that's because it was so well recorded. There's so many academics who've worked in it. There's so much resource. I mean, these people were scholars. They left a great deal of work, and so in some of my sort of early education, especially after reading *Staying Power* by Peter Fryer, was about those crucial figures. In terms of what I do, it doesn't play that big a part, because what I'm interested in is empire. It's in terms of my views about Black liberation, Pan-Africanism is a foundation, but actually my work is about what we're trying to liberate ourselves from. What I'm interested in is empire and slavery. What I'm interested in is the story of internationalism, of how Britain has created an insular island story version of its past to disguise the global interconnected colonial story. So it kind of means more to me personally than it does in my work. All of those figures are really interested, but I don't write about them, partly because I don't feel that I have to, because other people have done this so well. I mean, I said in my book, Black and British, I don't mention Pan-Africanism, I don't mention Garvey, because other people have done it. If I wanted to know that, I'd rather read Hakim Adi's work than feel that I have to study it. So these are, I guess, to me, it is part of a kind of foundational journey that I kind of want other Black people to go on, where I learned about these and it was useful in liberating my mind, but it's not the focus of my work.
Okay. You touched on your book, Black British Forgotten History, and I would implore everyone to read it and watch it. By the way, it's quite incredible. But the opening of the book takes us back to your childhood in the Northeast, and the racist attacks that your family had to endure in the 1970s at the hands of the National Front. So the fact that anyone should have to endure this kind of treatment is an indictment to the politicians of that era and the people who believed and followed them, in my personal opinion. So as we're witnessing ever-growing right-wing, like, fanaticism and a government who seems apathetic to the current politics around social justice, what challenges do you think this brings for the new emerging British, the Black British identity?
Well, I think British politics is not apathetic towards social justice. I think parts of British politics is seeking to weaponize social justice to create divisions between class and race. And I think that is the fundamental game plan of people like Steve Bannon, who've said as much. Yeah. And I think we can see it in this country. I think we can see attempts to create divisions along the lines of race and class, and to suggest that issues about seeking a challenge to racism, being anti-racist, gender rights and these sorts of things are antithetical to the views and the values and the culture of white people particularly from the North. I think we need to be fundamentally aware that that is the trap. You know, as much as I'm aware that if I get angry on the television program, that will make happy people who want to discredit me and the history that I care about, I think we need to be absolutely fundamentally aware that we are being ushered into a trap. And it's worked before. Look at what happened in America after the Civil War. Poor white people and poor black people trying to rebuild an absolutely devastated part of the world after one of the most devastating, costly wars that's ever happened up until the 1860s. And what happened was, when they came together, when they saw that their poverty united them and their class and their race didn't, the first Klan was invented. Huge efforts were made to make sure that poor white people and poor black people did not see that their poverty united them and that they had shared interests. I think we're in a similar place, and I think we need to be extremely careful. So that's a very, I'm afraid, technical political answer. But I don't think we're very good at this. I mean, I say no to things. I say no to going on television 90% of the time because it's to play the role in a pantomime which is designed to convince some white people that black people and their interests are antithetical to theirs. And I'm not a pawn in this form of political triangulation. So it's, as I said, it's not the answer I'd want to give. I wish we could talk more about these issues, but I think we also need to be aware that everything we say, everything people interested in race and racial justice say, is poured over in order to create these divisions.
That's very true. And again, I kind of think that in a sense dictates not just what we say, but in a sense like how we live or how we like navigate ourselves generally in society as well. It's all, I want to say it's all politics, but obviously there's more to it than that. Politics.
I think it's an extreme form of politics, and I think it's a form of, I mean, we use the phrase culture war. I think war is a pretty good sort of analogy here. It is about trying to fight politics by other means, by suggesting and convincing people that their culture, that their identity is being threatened by the existence and by the history of other people, which is why there are people who genuinely feel threatened by the idea that there were black people in Britain in the 16th century.
Yeah.
To me, that's an interesting fact. The fact that there was diplomats from North Africa, that there were people from Africa who'd come via the Iberian Peninsula, the fact that we have John Blanc, a trumpeter in the court of Henry VIII, we have businessmen in London selling needles, we have a diver on the Mary Rose doing salvage operations who's from Guinea. I think it's just interesting. There are a lot of people, it seems, who find this threatening because they have been convinced or they have concluded that history is a threat to their history and their identity. And to be unaware of that and to not be challenging that as well as telling these histories, I think we need to challenge that idea that why is this a threat? And also, I mean, why are these two communities different? I'm half white working class. Black people in Britain are one of the most integrated groups in Britain, both Africans, but particularly people from the West Indies. They have larger, more likely to have interracial members, relationships within their extended networks. Most black people I know, if you look at the big family photograph from the wedding or the christening and look at the big extended family, it's a mixture of people who are black and white and from other backgrounds. And yet we are being told that these divisions between white working class people and black people that sometimes run through us or run through our families can be weaponized against us. And I think we need to be absolutely alert. I mean, this is, the great fight of the people who gathered in Manchester in 1945 was that all but two countries in Africa were the colonial property of Europe, and that black people in America, black people in Britain were living in levels of repression, levels of disadvantage, and open legal prejudice that we today would struggle to imagine, because at least the prejudice we deal with is illegal, at least it's covert. That was their big struggle, and much of that remains a struggle. But I think our struggle is to be aware that there is an attempt to use the demands for liberation from black people to divide black people from white people, and it's extremely dangerous, and it's worked before.
Yeah, that kind of leads me into like this next question. Then, with my current generation, and younger generations, to be honest, like identifying as young, like British people, you know, we're desperate to learn more about the longer history of the Black presence in Britain, and that this history is still not being taught in schools. However, we have seen initiatives such as most recently the Free Black University trying to combat these sorts of these notions. So, do you think that this is the correct approach? And you know, if not, how would you approach it generally, do you think?
I think in some ways it's a traditional approach. There's a long history in post-war Britain of Black autodidactism. Black people have created Sunday schools. They've taught themselves and educated themselves and educated their children, and they haven't relied on the curriculum and the school system to do it for them. So I think the Black University and the Black Curriculum Organization that's had huge traction this year, I think they are part of a long tradition. But another long tradition is using history in the curriculum for political reasons. It's always been political. If you look at the reports, this is what my older sister's PhD is in, the reports that led to the 1870 Education Act, the act that's fundamental, that created really the British school system. History's, in all of those reports, history is about what political objectives can be achieved through the teaching of history. So it's always been political. I think there's, as well as maintaining the tradition of self-education, I think we need to do another thing. I think we need to challenge for two sorts of Black history. There's the Black history, which is the history of the Black presence in Britain. But there's also another form of Black history, which is, I'm not sure Black history is the right word. I think we need to challenge the way the curriculum is blind to the ways in which the moments in which the chapters of our past, in which the stories of Black people are fundamental to what we think of as mainstream British history. Because it's not just Black history that's been offshored in the way we think about history in this country. It is the whole imperial story. We come to think of history as stuff that happens just within these islands, and everything else is kind of not really British history. We imagine that somewhere like Jamaica, a part of England and Britain's sphere of influence, a place in union with England from 1655, that's what happens there kind of isn't really Britain. It really isn't us. It's kind of colonial history. It doesn't really matter. And that offshoring of history is the way that British people who are frightened of these histories can just keep them at a distance. They can, here's something I find really interesting. The clear historical fact that seems to upset and offend more people than any other is the reality that there were Black people in Britain in the 17th and 18th century who lived as slaves. And we know that because we've got document after document. We've got documents for the sale of Black children in the port of Bristol, 2 miles away from where I'm talking to you from now. We've got advertisements for the return of enslaved Black people who've run away. We've got the legal cases of Jonathan Strong and the famous Somerset case of 1772. We've got all of this evidence to show that Black people lived as slaves in Britain, not in huge numbers, but they did.
Exactly.
We even have the artifacts. We have the collars, the damn collars that people were made to wear to indicate that they were slaves. And there are still people who will say anything, who will refute documents you can put in front of them to say there was never slavery in Britain. It was in the Caribbean. And that's so interesting, because as long as they can push it to the Caribbean, then somehow it doesn't count. As long as the violence and the brutality and the exploitation took place an ocean away, it's not on the ledger. It's not something we need to worry about. It's not really British history. And so the reality of slavery in Britain is something that, even despite the weight of historical evidence, needs to be attacked. And I'm constantly being accused in letters, in social media, in attacks under articles I write in newspapers, of lying about this history, even though there's 900 of these documents being found by a program at Glasgow University. And I don't mind what people say about me online. I don't care. But it's really interesting that is such a battle that people want to fight. And it shows that we've offshored our history. So Black history has been disavowed and denied and marginalized because it's part of the imperial history, because we know that that's where the dark stuff is. And we don't want to confront it as a country. So I kind of think rewiring the history we tell in school to show that it is a fundamentally imperial story for 5 centuries is the reality. This needs to pretend the empire didn't matter, to pretend none of it counted. It's a real fundamental kind of historical, psychological issue. In 1961, I'm sorry, this is a long answer. In 1961, Enoch Powell gave a speech on St. George's Day, not the Rivers of Blood speech, this is 7 years earlier. And in this speech, what he said was that Britain had created this vast empire, and it had kind of been an accident almost. And now it was coming to an end. And he used this phrase, he said that Britain had been unaffected by the great edifice that had been built around her, that Britain had not been affected for 4 centuries of being a trading, maritime, global imperial power. And that now what he called the strange races had gone because we were leaving the empire, and that the British found themselves again on their islands, under their oak trees, drinking mead and reading Chaucer. And he made this appeal for people to transport themselves mentally back in history all the way through the Victorians, the Georgians, the Stuarts, the Tudors, and to find their English ancestors before the ships had set sail for Africa in the 1540s, before we'd had these encounters, before we'd transformed our culture, our language, our cuisine by encounters with other people. He said, there you will find them, our true English ancestors. This is an absolute fantasy, that you can just pretend that you're waking up from a dream 4 centuries later, like a sort of bad 1950s Hollywood film. You're waking up for a dream, and none of that really happened. It was all a dream. And that is seriously what Powell and others suggested. And this idea that as long as we can just pretend it didn't matter, pretend it was over there, that we can maintain and we can shore up this fantasy island version of British history, that is, I think, subconsciously in many cases, the game plan, the need, the deep emotional, psychological need of quite a lot of people in this country.
Wow. It's kind of left me like speechless after that. And I think that kind of relates to, in fact, it definitely relates to this day and age now, because I think, obviously, we've gone back to this whole notion of politics plays an extremely, extremely important part in this whole process, or like the overall narrative. But then when you see recent things like the Department for Education's guidance instructing English schools not to use material that's critical of capitalism, to use anti-capitalist material because it's an extreme political stance, you then start questioning, how do you think schools could actually implement these sorts of teachings of colonialism and imperialism into their curriculum if they're being told, they're not allowed, essentially.
Well, I mean, it's literally, it makes some of the curriculum not teachable. I mean, what is the Tolpuddle Martyrs? What is Chartism? What is the rise of the trade union and the labor movement, other than challenging forms of capitalism and especially libertarian capitalism? When it comes to race, I mean, this is really interesting. I think we have to understand that edict alongside the sort of Black history that was described by the Prime Minister. And what he described and what they're in favor of is, I think, a trap, which is to that political position. Black history is fundamentally about one word. It's about contribution. It's about Black individuals who were the first mayor or the first soldier or the first doctor. It's about individual Black people and Black biographies who can be celebrated and put within a British context. And what it is not about is about racism as an idea. It's not about slavery. It's not about imperialism. It's a form of Black history that's kind of harmless. It just says there were Black people here that were just like everybody else. Let's ignore the fact that they weren't treated like everybody else. Let's ignore the fact that what brought them here was a vast global empire built on the exploitation of non-white people. And let's just celebrate the fact that some of them became doctors and some of them became soldiers, and served was the word used a lot by the Prime Minister. That form of Black British history, which I think too often we just go along with, that is a trap. If we only do that, and it's not to say that's not important. It was important to me growing up. It was important to me as a 16-year-old boy who read Peter Fry's book Staying Power and understood my story in this country for the first time. It's important, but it's just as important to tell the stories of not Black individuals, but of millions of Black people whose labor and whose lives and whose bodies were harvested by the British Empire and by British trade and by British capitalism. one of the reasons, well, there's two reasons why the Pan-African Conference took place in Manchester. One is that Ras Monokan had set up a business there. He knew everybody, and he could hire facilities and halls and accommodation more easily. I mean, there's a really perfunctory, practical reason. But one of the other reasons that the organisers said is because that they were well aware that Manchester is Cottonopolis, to give it its 19th century nickname, that was a city built on the cotton trade, that the 4,500 mills that surrounded Manchester in Lancashire and Cheshire and in the central belt of Scotland, that what fueled them was raw cotton from 80,000 plantations in the Mississippi Valley and the Deep South, and that on them worked 1.8 million African Americans, who were half of the 4 million African Americans who lived in chains in the years before the Civil War. Manchester's built on cotton. They were absolutely aware of that. Now, that form of Black history, that form that shows that the industry that accounted for 40% of Britain's exports by the 1850s, the industry that The Economist magazine estimated employed 1 in 5 people, 20% of the population, being either directly or indirectly dependent on the cotton trade by the middle of the 19th century. That form of Black history is not what they want. They want Mary Seacole. They want black doctors and Black soldiers. They don't want 1.8 million faceless people whose bodies were harvested to make Britain rich. And if we just give them the stuff they want, the individual biographical form that's about community formation and lives in Britain, if we go along with that and do not expand Black history to be a fundamentally colonial and economic story, they'll all be happy and we won't get anywhere. Yeah.
And the reason, I think one of the main reasons I gravitate towards you, and I think a lot of people do gravitate towards you, is because you're not just passionate, but what you're speaking is truth. It's fact. It's historical fact. And I often see on YouTube or Twitter, on the comment sections of either your videos or conversations you've had, I see a lot of, for lack of a better term, I see a lot of ignorance, right? And I see.
I don't look, so I don't know. I'm sure it's there. I haven't looked.
But for example, or maybe if you're being called out in The Guardian or whatever, do you feel the need to respond to people who are clearly ignorant or just misinformed, or do you just, like majority, obviously you ignore it at times, but do you ever feel that you need to respond at any point?
Well, I don't in newspapers, because I don't listen, I don't read below the line. I don't on YouTube or other. The only thing I do is on Twitter. And the reason that I respond on Twitter, I mean, there's two reasons. One is that Black people are constantly told that racism doesn't exist, that they are the source of racism, that Black people talking about racism and talking about their history is what's keeping racism alive. In the ultimate kind of form of blame the victim. It's you talking about your oppression that leads to your oppression. And so I like to, when people send me, the sort of stuff that many people do not believe exists online, to quote tweet it and to make jokes about it. The one thing I never do is get angry or upset about it. So I often quote it and make jokes about it. And one reason for this is because I spend most of my day reading and writing and making television programs and dealing with really complicated ideas and books written by really clever people. And 280 characters written by an idiot is actually my light relief, making fun of the nonsense people say, because it's the one thing that almost all of those emails have in common. And the one thing that the people who write them have in common is they will do anything. They will say libelous things online. They will say abusive things online. They will get themselves banned from social media. They'll do anything other than any basic research. And so it's just so palpably easy to make fun of it and to dispute it. And I mean, I'm told that I don't mention things I've made programs about. Somebody accused me of never having mentioned the Royal Navy's slavery suppression squadrons that were formed in 1807 and ran through till 1911 in the Atlantic and then the Indian Oceans. Somebody accused me of never having mentioned it, and then quoted something that he'd found on a meme that was from one of my books to show that I'd never written about it. I'm accused of deliberately ignoring parts of history I've made programs about. Yeah. So it's just so easy to refute that I'm doing it partly because I think it's important to show people the existence of the sort of racial abuse that exists online. The same as I get a insight into the level of misogynistic view online because I look at the abuse and sometimes I'm tagged in the abuse that's sent to my friend Mary Beard. And any naivety I used to have about what it was like to be female on Twitter, that's gone. But I do it partly because it's just, it's so easy to refute. I think you lose. And I think the real mistake to do is to try to be angry or aggressive with them. I think, again, it's to make fun of it. It's just such nonsense. I mean, there was a recent thing where somebody had made a meme. I mean, they'd gone as far as actually building a meme saying that that because of the removing of Colston's statue and Colston's name from Concert Hall in Bristol, they're saying, well, should we take Julius Caesar's name off the Caesar salad? And they'd made this meme and hadn't worked out. They hadn't bothered to look to see that the Caesar salad was named after a Mexican restaurant owner in the 1940s. If you're making memes and you can't even be bothered to Google the argument you're making, that's, I'm sorry, it's my light entertainment to make fun of idiots, because most of the time I'm dealing with very complicated ideas written by very clever people.
True. Very true. Brilliant. Well, I kind of feel like that's the end of my selfish questions here. Let's open it up to the audience. So the first question is actually from Ayla, and she says, "Hi David. Like in the US, there is a national museum dedicated to Black Afro-American history and heritage. What about the same here? A timeline going back thousands of years. What do you think?"
Well, that museum was brought about partly because America has the genius that is Lonnie Bunch, who is now the head of the Smithsonian Institute. I'm actually on the phone to him in a couple of days' time. We're making a program with the Smithsonian. And it was also brought about because of a tradition that we don't have, which is African Americans have a tradition of philanthropy, of giving money back. Almost every famous African American has given money to institutes like that. And if you go into the National Museum on the Mall in Washington, in some ways, one of the most impressive things in that museum is not the brilliant, incredible building built by a British Nigerian architect, David Ajay. It's not even the incredible artifact. It's got Marcus Garvey's hat. It's got Leadbelly's 12-string guitar. They're kind of breathtaking, emotional things for me to see. The most impressive thing is the list of people, of famous African Americans, who gave money for the building of that museum and for the purchase of its collection. And if you look at the exhibits, the number of exhibits that have been donated by African American organizations and institutions, it's incredibly impressive. Now, African Americans are around 10-11% of the population of a country that's almost 400 million, 40 million plus African Americans. We are 3.3% of the population. The BAME population is 14, getting on for 14%. We're a much smaller country. We're never going to have the economic power. We're never going to have the cultural power of African Americans. But with all that said, we still have very little. Now, we have the Black Cultural Archive in Brixton, and we haven't supported it enough. How many people on this call have become, I know this is Manchester, not London, but if 1 in 10 Black Londoners became members of the Black Cultural Archive, it would be able to have the money to fund its collection. It would be an organization that would be able to sort of reach out and buy the artifacts that it needs, and to expand into the buildings around it, and to maybe move to a bigger premises. If it got support from the government, if we had a bigger political lobby. We don't have enough voice. We don't have enough power. And it's partly because we don't engage in politics enough. And that's an odd thing to say in some ways, because Black people have been so political this year. But politics is dirty. It's grubby. It's about not saying what you think because you'll fall into a trap. It's about seeing what Steve Bannon is saying about weaponizing race against class. I don't think we're good enough at being political. I don't think there's enough. We haven't got the organizations African Americans have got. We haven't got the NAACP. I don't think we've been smart enough in building political organizations. And so we haven't got the fruits of those political organizations.
Yeah. Whilst you were answering that question, you actually answered another one that was in regards to, is there a case for a National Black History Archive in England, and the fact that there is already one here that just... There
is, and I think it should be better known, and I'm trying to do my little to make it better known. I mean, I want us to make some programs using the collections at the John Rylands Library. But I have to admit that before I came to Manchester University, I didn't know that about that library, and I should have done. And we need to shout about it a lot more.
Definitely.
But we need to make programs. We need to get this stuff. I was talking this morning to an Asian filmmaker who's got a story which I think is fantastic, and they've been told that story is too small. That's just nonsense.
Wow.
You know, the gatekeepers aren't listening. The gatekeepers they're just not right about this history. And I think we need to be much, much pushier about things like that. That collection should be well known, because one of the problems with Black history, this desire to push it all away, to make it all about what happened over there, is that we don't know the heroes. We don't know the good news because we're so frightened as a country of the bad news. So we don't know the big stories and the big names within this history, the things that could get name recognition, that could be part of the national story.
Exactly. So this next question is from Naomi. She asked, one of the claims that is made by those who seek to whitewash the past is that Black Africans were themselves engaged in the slave trade. Could you comment on this?
Well, I mean, it's obviously true. I mean, there were Black traders. There's also a sort of Luso-African, Luso-Portuguese community on the coast of mixed race people. Of course there is, because what the slave trade did was it destroyed societies, it disaggregated societies, it created wars, it created disruption. It was one of the most devastating and damaging phenomena ever to befall any part of the world. And of course, Africans were complicit in it. The same as if you go to any story of invasion or occupation in Europe, there's people who are collaborators with it. There are leaders who are quislings. I mean, the word quisling is named after a collaborating leader. Of course there are, because Europeans and Africans behave like every other people in the world, because they're just another type of human being. And some of them are awful and evil and complicit, and some of them are resistance fighters or leaders who fight for the interests of their people. And you know, there's a long list of African leaders, Nigerian leaders, who are infamous slave traders. There's also a long list of African leaders who fought against the slave trade. There's also a long history of resistance to the slave trade. So the answer is, of course, Africans were involved in the slave trade, because this was like an atom bomb thrown on the continent. It destroyed societies. It led to hundreds of years of wars, and Africa still not recovered from it. But nothing that was done on the coast of Africa justifies what happened on the plantations of Jamaica or Barbados or Virginia. And when I'm in Nigeria, I'm complaining about the status of history in Nigeria. I'm complaining that we don't talk about the complicity of the Obas of Lagos, where I was born, in the slave trade. But when I'm in Britain, I'm talking about our history and how we ignore our history. So there's a book behind me written in 1919 called The Vice Book, and it's a German book written at the time of the Versailles Treaty, and it lists all of the crimes of the British Empire, and most of it is accurate. And it was written because Britain and France were listing the crimes of the German Empire that the Germans had committed in Namibia as a pretext to strip Germany of our African colonies, which is what they did at the Treaty of Versailles. And Germany's response was to go, well, look at the terrible things you did. Well, so what? So what? The Africa and Nigeria, other countries need to confront the legacy of the slave trading leaders. That's Nigeria's issue. Nigeria needs to do that. Exactly. We're in Britain, and I'm a British citizen, and I want us to confront our history. And this is exactly what Germany tried to do after the First World War. Don't look at our history, look at your own. Well, you can do both.
Exactly. Question from Halima. So she's interested to hear your take on a genuinely anti-racist future. What does it look like, and how do we get there in terms of things like material global action and policy?
I think we get there if the ideas that have been landed in the minds of millions of people this year germinate and lead to actions. I mean, the critical ideas that have been put into public discourse this year is the idea of structural racism. Racism is not about individual actions, and that good people can act in ways that are damaging to non-white peoples unintentionally or intentionally. I think the idea of allyship has been landed in a big way this year. And I think that this idea of anti-racism itself, the idea that it is an activity rather than a passive position, I think those are the rhetorical tools that are needed. And I think it's about momentum. As I said at the beginning, that there's that old sort of, aphorism about, when the boulder's rolling, already moving, you can keep it rolling. this has been a year of unexpected change and progress. It's up to us how much it keeps going, and we've got to hold organizations to account. I gave a lecture this summer in my industry, the television industry, the one which I spend most of my time working in, and there are a series of initiatives and promises in television unlike anything I've ever seen before, but we have 30 years of failed initiatives. So it's kind of, it's now or never. It's all to play for. It's, this feels new and feels different, but we've had failures in the past. I think in industry after industry and sector after sector, in multiple parts of our society, we're in exactly that place. What we've done up until now, palpably, demonstrably, evidentially, hasn't worked. These are the new tools.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can we use them to actually affect real change this time?
Yeah. I think we have time for a couple more questions. I'm just kind of trying to sieve out the best ones for you. Okay, this one is from Shafkat, and he asked, how do you perceive or mentally articulate the naming systems we've had, whether it's BAME or POC, in terms of self-identification, official classifications and coalition work?
I think this may be a generational thing. I don't worry about it as much as I think many young people do. I think BAME is a useful term. It's a statistically useful term. It speaks to something. As long as you can also have specificity of people of African heritage and people of color, then I don't really worry about it as much. I'm a historian. I'm not somebody who comes entirely from the world of critical theory. It's not to say it's not important, but I think we spend too much time thinking about it.
Super. And then the last question then. This one is from Julia. She asks, in your opinion, should universities in the UK, which are often viewed as world-class and being put on a pedestal to an extent, should they set a restorative justice scheme and acknowledge that many were built, benefited from, and contributed to the transatlantic slave trade?
Yes, there should be part of a global movement that's happening in America. The University of Glasgow in this country is an example of acknowledging that if these are places of where knowledge is created, and some of that knowledge was created in order to justify and sustain enslavement and empire, and that is complicity, that is being involved. It's not just about the money and the bequests that needs to be understood. And I'm in Bristol, and we have Olivette Ortel, who is investigating Bristol's financial history and the roots of money from slavery in the financial DNA of the university. We also need to know what role these universities played in the development of the race idea, in the justification of empire, of pseudo-racial sciences. And that's obvious. That's what we need to do. If you we ask other countries to hold themselves to account. If you go to the outskirts of Berlin, to the suburb of Dahlem, you'll see the Max Planck Institute, which used to be known as the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and it's covered in plaques acknowledging the fact that it was there that the race scientist, the racial hygienist, as he was called, Eugen Fischer, worked, developing his theories of about racial mixing and degeneration. And it was there that the young Josef Mengele worked, and it was to there that he sent back human remains from the concentration camps. Germany's not perfect, but Germany is able to acknowledge this sort of stuff. Germany's universities are looking at their complicity. Universities, museums, other institutions, hospitals need to confront what they did and what they were part of. And it's not about guilt, it's about responsibility.
Fantastic. Well, okay, I've got a final question for you because I think you might like this one. So this is from Dr. Velma McClyman, and she asks, what would you say to historians like Professor Sir Tom Devine from Edinburgh Uni, for example, who publicly refused to discuss reparations at the Brigade in Glasgow in July 2014? He had refused to answer her question, which was, please also to touch on David Starkey's comment that slavery was not genocide. And he also added, those damn blacks.
I wasn't present, and I don't know what was said. I mean, I know Professor Devine's work. I don't know what his position was. I mean, I'm slightly cautious about these sort of things because sometimes people ask me to comment on things that I just haven't seen. And from that, it's interpreted that I have a certain position that I don't. I don't want to speak about an incident, an encounter, an exchange that I wasn't there or haven't read about.
To be honest, I think that's the perfect answer. Now, I think that kind of wraps up all of this dialogue between you and I. It's been absolutely wonderful. I personally can say, on behalf of the whole Pan-African Conference Committee, and if I'm brave enough, I'll say on behalf of the Black British students here at the University of Manchester and Manchester Metropolitan, respectively. David, Mr. Olusoga, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you very much. And I'm really sorry I'm not in Manchester for obvious reasons. And I look forward to a post-pandemic world when I can finally get back on the train to Manchester and we can do this sort of thing in person.
Super. Personally, I believe that, with your help, we're at a pivotal turning point, a very, very pivotal turning point. But whether that will come lasting change remains to be seen. So, to finish off, do you have a plug? I want to plug, shout out anything you want.
Well, I'm slightly embarrassed to plug my new book because the only reason that I wrote it is because I was nagged to write it. And I actually should have written it 4 years ago. I wrote a young adult version of my book, Black and British. And I kept being asked by parents, why haven't you written a children's book? So I don't know how many books are written out of guilt, but that one was written out of guilt. And I promised myself next time I write a book about empire or Black history, I'm going to start writing the youth version the day I finish the adult version, because I know what it was like to be brought up without this history available. And I think I had a responsibility that I shirked for 4 years of not making this history that I'd written more available to young people. So I've got that version out now, and there's a young children's illustrated version next year. And I'm looking back at what I've written in the past and trying to make it more accessible for young people and children. And I've learned my lesson. And thank you to everybody who confronted me on the street and told me I was letting down Black history by not writing children's books. I've learned a lesson.
Super. Thank you very much, David. So now we're actually going to be moving on to, so the students here at Manchester, at the University of Manchester, they were working with Ola and a few other tutors in regards to a virtual Black history map and a history walk throughout Manchester. So David, by all means, you can stay. But just to explain that this is an ongoing project and it will expand on the history and the narratives of the Black community in Manchester. So let's move on to that now. Thank you very much again, David.
Hello, just an interim discussion now. If you're expecting the voices of literature and poetry, we're just delaying that by 15 minutes so we can have the students present their Black history map of Manchester. So we're running 15 minutes behind the next program. It will run, but we have a 10-minute presentation from the students with Quadri and his colleagues. Over to you.
Hi, so my name's Ariel Chesley, and I'm a 6th-year student at the Manchester School of Architecture studying architecture. And so a group of us, part of the BLM ARC at MSA team, we have kind of started this pilot project where we want to do a virtual walk of Black sites throughout Manchester. And it's an ongoing project, so we've pretty much, we're going to use QGIS to map these sites, and this is the result of 2 weeks of work. So we've focused on 10 specific sites, but we've got a running list of sites that we're working with professors such as Ola, and yeah, we just like to show you. So let me just share my screen. So this is the GIS map that we have of Manchester, and we've got different categories. So we've color coded based on what kind of sites they are. So the red is music and arts, the green is social, the blue is academic sites. And so I'm going to click on a couple. Mega's going to jump in just to speak about these sites. So the first one, we're going to start with Manchester Art Gallery here. Would you like to just...
So as Ariel mentioned before, we've actually categorized all these sites into sectors. So as you can see, the Manchester Art Gallery has been put in red, which means that it's in the music and art section. And the reason why we plotted this site itself was to showcase the fact that the first piece of art acquired by the gallery in 1827 was actually a portrait of a celebrated Black actor, Ira Aldrich. It was titled A Moor and was painted by James Northcote in 1826. And the painting shows the actor in the role of Othello, and he was the first Black actor to play a Shakespearean role. So you can see that as you click on each of the points, we showcase kind of pictures and the captions to explain why we've picked those points. Another site that we can have a look at is the Arthur Lewis building. And you can see that the Arthur Lewis building has been mapped as a blue point under the academic sector. This building is in the University of Manchester's campus and was named in 2007 after Arthur Lewis, who was the first Black academic to have this honour. So Arthur Lewis was an economist who was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics in 1979. He was the first Black student to study in LSE, where he specialised in development economics. He went on to teach at the University of Manchester for around 10 years and became an economic advisor to the newly formed Ghanaian government and worked on their 5-year development plan. He's also taught at Princeton and became the first VC of the University of West Indies. And if you go to the building itself, there is actually a plaque to commemorate and celebrate Arthur Lewis and the history behind the name of the building.
Another site that we've chosen are the plaques at Hume Park, as well as the Denise Johnson mural. And so basically this project will become layered over time. So we want to take it forward and hopefully be able to either overlay archival maps eventually to show that there's a change over time of Manchester's built environment and streets. And so the aim of the project is to be able to have all of this information in one spot and also eventually record the narratives of important people in these sites. So any people that might have lived there or were important community leaders or even owned some of these sites, so that we can start to overlay this information in a meaningful way. Yeah, so that concludes our map.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think this is a really important project that is going on, and I think we wish them well. I think particularly because this is a public discussion now, we're very concerned that we actually have the voices of those who are part of or who are part of the history of Black Manchester, and we're able to actually work with them to record more of this history. Because we know right up to today, we've got Marcus Rashford, who's absolutely critical to the current discussions about child poverty, child hunger, but we know this history goes right back even earlier than the Pan-African Congress, which David Olusoga has just talked about and highlighted. So we really want this to be an inclusive map that we're able to really draw in all the information and start to remember the history of Manchester, certainly from a Black perspective. But so students, thank you very much again. And yeah, we're hoping to see more of it as you develop it further, maybe in the archives that we're hoping that we will be able to support. But thank you again, and thank you to the team, and also thank you to the staff, particularly at Manchester School of Architecture, who have supported this project as well. Okay, I think we can say goodbye to you all. There is another event happening now on YouTube, or you can move straight on to the to your Eventbrite link to the project. But students, thank you very much, and we hope you've enjoyed it and you'll continue to do more of this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.